This is Mo and Raj and Rosenbaum Are Humans, and we're here today with Avery Alder. Ben's going to introduce Avery to you all.
Avery is my favorite role-playing game designer and collaborator on a thing we did a couple years back, which I was really excited about, which was, for me, like a fairy tale story of getting to go from fan to collaborator and like have my debut as a role-playing game designer in the best possible way that I could have imagined it. That's the short introduction. Avery has done a bunch of amazing games, which listeners may know of: Monster Hearts, A Quiet Year, Ribbon Drive, Dream Askew, and a whole bunch of also wonderful little strange games. I think like Brave Sparrow, and the things that also are. And I forget the name of the body horror one that I like so much, but like games that push the envelope. Yes, Abnormal. Games that push the envelope of what games are, just things that are really exciting. And also, I'm a big fan of, and we should link in the show notes, Avery's talk on beyond representation queer game mechanics, which I think we should, might be worth briefly summarizing, just because it's such an interesting idea, and I think relates to a lot of things that we talk about even beyond games, about there's sort of the superficial aspects of like, oh, we get to see lots of different kinds of people in this world, but then there's also like, if you're still telling the same narrative structure, in a way you can switch out the players, but there's a way in which you've inherited certain. Anyway, I don't know if I'm doing it.
Wait, hang on. I'm gonna pause you though, because
sure.
I feel like, so we generally a lot talk about fiction on this podcast, and I know that I have a lot of friends in the world who are not familiar with RPGs. They maybe, they might have a kid who plays D&D, or, they're thinking their kid might be interested in playing D&D, right? But they themselves, I think especially like I'm almost 50, right? And so D&D was my era growing up, and I played then. But I think people who came in like the decade or two after that, that was not nearly as much a part of their growing up experience, right? So I have a lot of like mom friends in their early 40s, late 30s, who have no familiarity with RPGs at all, right? And so I think maybe just like a little mini, like, what is an RPG? How does this connect to fiction? If maybe Avery, do you want to take a stab at it since you've done a lot of them?
Okay, yeah. So at its heart, a tabletop role-playing game brings people together, usually around a table. And the game is a set of rules and narrative prompts, and often kind of like a fantastical world to step into and tell stories together. And if you pull a random group of people around a table and say like, okay, for the next 4 hours, just like tell a really good story, they'll freeze up. I feel like even if they are creative writers, like you put them in that pressure cooker situation, like often they're gonna choke. But role-playing games, all these rules and all these little narrative prompts and constraints, what they do is they help like kind of narrow that creative process down to like, you have this one character and you're making these choices like moment to moment. And the rules are always giving you these creative, interesting, shifting constraints to work with. So there's always that like leading moment to moment of like, okay, now the situation is this, what do you do? Okay, now the situation is this, what do you do? And different games work in different ways, but I think like at its heart, it's kind of a creative improvisational activity that you do for yourselves, not for an audience typically. And the game part of it, the rules, the components, they're all there to give you interesting, limited choices that kind of challenge you to come up with something that you wouldn't have come up with on your own.
And when you talk about it like that, it makes me think of sonnets, right? Like here's a very structured thing, and that somehow, committing to this, syllabic pattern and rhyme scheme frees you up in certain ways, right? And I don't know, in teaching, we talk about scaffolding a lot, and like
I was just going to use that word.
Like the game mechanics provide some kind of scaffold. I'll say for anyone listening who is having a hard time envisioning sitting around a table to do collaborative storytelling, I actually did this with my son for chores, right? And we would we would just you know, he had a scenario of his world that he'd invented, and then we'd have some characters and be having a talk story adventure as we were putting away laundry. As you know, it makes tedious chores go much faster. So
I think of, I was going to say scaffolding. I think of it as like the scaffolding that adults require to be able to play Let's Pretend.
yeah.
Like if you're 4, you don't need anything. You're just like, and then there's a monster, and it comes, and this, oh, let's do this. You know what I mean? And you know, as Avery said, adults just choke up given that. So it's the scaffolding that puts you back in that space of being, you know, like playing with Star Wars action figures on your carpet when you're 6.
Okay, this is a little segue, but I'm curious, like, I have recently realized that when I'm writing science fiction and fantasy, the hardest part for me is the invention piece. And it's thrown in relief when I'm talking to my kids about it, because they, you know, my 11-year-old can just invent, as you say, right? And I have real trouble with it. And doing something like an RPG, for, you know, like I wrote an RPG set in my sci-fi universe in part to help myself invent more elements of the universe, right? Do you feel like that's a common? I kind of thought it was just me. So, but it sounds like you think it's more common than that, perhaps, for adults writing genre stuff, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think all levels of invention, like inventing world building, but also inventing plot, inventing character, like what should the person do next? And you know, like Avery was saying, if you narrow it down, if there's a structure that gives you, you know, it's a little like, I don't know, like I'm not very good at yoga. I'm doing yoga with my wife now because there's literally no other sport or anything I can do during the pandemic. And so like I need to put blocks under my, you know what I mean? I'm gonna hurt myself if there's not a block under my, so it's like, you know,
Right.
cushioning the space so that you're inventing a little and then a little more and then a little more, as opposed to just like, woof, everything is possible.
And I mean, hey, I can connect this to gender, because there's this whole thing with push-ups, right? And this whole thing about, like, at the school, my daughter is being asked to do push-ups as part of gym classes, and she gets frustrated because she's like, I can't do push-ups. And I think that's a really common thing for the girls to, like, oh no, I can't do push-ups. And I'm like, are they making you start on the floor with like normal push-ups? And she's like, yes. And I'm like, well, there's a sequence when I work with my trainer, right? Like the way she got me to push-ups was we started with wall push-ups and then table push-ups, and you know, and she has the big machine that lets you like move the rod down, and so you're just
really ability. I mean, really, it's a broader conversation about just like everybody is pushing everybody into some normative model.
Yes, but I would say that because women are not trained to do push-ups typically, like there's just sort of an assumption of this is beyond you, right? Like if you can't do it naturally, then you just don't do it. And in fact, it doesn't take that long to move from wall push-ups to floor push-ups, right?
Right. So I think it's a general thing about our like this is getting off topic, but just very briefly, like the sort of that is a good example of how tiny differences are magnified by the cultural framework, where it's just like, if you can already do this if you can do it in 5 minutes, then you get to do it for the rest of your life. And if you fail in the first 5 minutes, then we discard your, you know, and that's an amplifier. Okay, but so let's go back to, Avery, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel like that's also like a product of living in a culture that really emphasizes expertise and experts. Just like there are people who can do push-ups and there are people who can't do push-ups, I feel like I think, like, returning again to role-playing games, there's often this idea like there are people who can tell stories and create content, and there are people who can't, who must consume it. And I just find, like, in general, with most types of expertise, like the illusion that that expertise is really unreachable is like more substantive than the actual truth of the matter. And that usually, like, most people can do most things if they are like put in the proper context, given the proper support, given like a small enough like starting point, right? And I think the role-playing games the design of them is all about doing that.
That's super.
that's a sort of mantra that I used in raising my son who's autistic. What I told him from the beginning when we were sort of explaining that this was and everything was always like, everybody can learn everything. Some people learn some things quicker than others. Like, people's are optimized for learning different things in different ways. So like, you can, all of these skills that the world expects you of, it's sort of unfair that there's this expectation that you be like everybody else, screw that. And B, you can learn all of those things. Like, you don't have to think the way that other people think in order to eventually, with enough support, given enough time, like, to be able to learn. I'm not sure. I'm not saying this is a useful place to start from. I'm
Yeah.
not claiming scientifically that there is absolutely no. I mean, sure, if you had a severe enough injury, I'm sure there's some things you can't do. But what I'm saying is, like, the presumption that it will just take you longer to learn this thing is a very powerful pedagogical framing.
I would also, I mean, now you're making me think, and maybe we can use this to segue into talking about how Avery's games are as much art as games, perhaps.
Yeah.
It makes me think about, I don't know whether you guys read Lloyd Alexander's High King series with Tar and Wanderer. I don't know if you remember, if
I
you've
did
ever.
back in the day. Yeah.
So Tar and Wanderer is
Underappreciated. I
he's
think.
oh my
I
God,
don't know how well it holds
I
up.
love this book so much. It's book 4 of the series. Book 5 is also excellent, and they made a mark on me. And in book 4, he's a young adult trying to find his career path in life, right? And so he goes and he tries fisherman, he tries various things, and he develops the skills at each one. He like doesn't know how to do it at first, but he starts small, has a teacher, goes on. The one that breaks my heart is when he takes up pottery and he's making pots under the tutelage of this artist. And he gets to a point where he kind of says to the artist, like, and he's put like a year of work into this, right? And he's like, I'm never going to be able to make art with these pots, right? And the potter says, very sad, like they're both super sad about it, that, like you could totally go on and have a good business and a good career making pots. But I'm not seeing that thing that you're longing for in your work. And it's just, I don't know. I mean, it's he goes on, and Taran goes on to become High King, and it's okay. But that's it, it's this interesting moment of like, how do we, um, we can talk about competency, we can talk about learning how to do things well, practice, et cetera, so on. Is there something ineffable that takes it to the realm of art? I don't know that there's an answer, but maybe we could use that to transition into, I kind of want to talk about One Quiet Year, which I know you wrote pre-pandemic, but it seems so relevant to the pandemic. So maybe if you could tell listeners a little about the game. And how you came to do it, and was that your first big game, or
no?
I wouldn't say so, no. But I first designed it in the period of 2010 to 2012, and it got released kind of like January, February 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's a game about a community that is living through, has lived through the collapse of society and civilization. They're relatively cut off, isolated, and they have a year in which they, like any immediate existential threats have been driven away, and they have a year to kind of regroup, assess what is in scarcity and what is in abundance, and figure out how to work together to try and build something up. And rather than being a role-playing game about individual characters, which is the norm, right? Like normally when you sit down and play a role-playing game, each person's like, here's my one character. And I navigate the entire story and build it through the perspective of this one character. And The Quiet Year is about community in a really different way. And so it asks everyone to kind of collectively represent the diffuse political currents within the community, and kind of to do this like ephemeral collaborative storytelling as the community as a whole. And I think of it as a game that is less about the story of what individuals accomplish and more about the story about how communities navigate process. And a lot of the kind of in individual turns, which each turn is a week of the year, there's a really like immediate like what do we do with these resources? How do we deal with these wolves? Where is our next clean water supply going to be coming from? But more broadly, when you kind of zoom out a little bit, there's this bigger situation of like, okay, listen, we only have so much time. Theoretically, we want to sit everyone down and have like big, robust consensus building conversations. And theoretically, we want to be exploring new opportunities and seeing what's out there. And theoretically, we want to be like acting as swiftly and immediately to address immediate dire needs. But we can't do all three of those things. And every week, we just have to pick one. So there's this kind of like, how does a community function?
I'll tell you, I'm running for office again right now, and I ran 4 years ago, and I served, and I'm running again, and this is really making me flash to village board meetings and the way things get. It's super easy to get distracted by minutiae when there are wolves at the door that you should probably be paying more attention to, right? And there are never enough resources for everything you'd like to do. So how do you prioritize? And then personalities get involved. Anyway.
Definitely a game about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I want to play it
or also, but I have to say that it's a very gentle take on that too. Like in a way, I mean, I feel like also compared to Dream Askew, which is less, which you are playing an individual character, so it's less, but it also is about a community, but it's also about, I think it might be fair to say, sort of more overtly about a lot of the tensions and messiness of the Quiet Year has this the remove that you're playing as sort of a part of the whole community, sort of an unstated, gives it this, it has this enormous gentleness as a game. And the mechanics are so interesting. I mean, Avery, say a little about like how it is that you go about playing as not just a person. I mean, there are cards and drawings.
I covered a lot of it, but at the center of the table is the map that you're drawing as you go. Parts of it are literal cartography, so you're drawing like a mountain or a building or a river, and then parts of it are symbolic. So you're like, here's a skull on fire, and that represents like this specific tension in our community, or like here's a rainbow with a big X through it at this point. And so as you're going, you have this map that starts out looking like a map, and in the end, it's something that will be unintelligible to anyone who hasn't played the Quiet Year. But like looking at one, I'm like, oh, that's a Quiet Year map. Like immediately, I know exactly what's going on here. I don't totally understand what this tentacle monster is, but like I get it at the same time, you know. And so you're drawing this map as you go. It's a turn-based game, so it's kind of halfway between like a board game and a role-playing game in a lot of ways. And yeah, each turn, the active player draws a card from the top of the deck, and it has prompts, and usually it's 2 different prompts that kind of play off of one another. Like for example, like you discover an ancient piece of machinery, terrible and cursed. How do you destroy it? Or like you discover an abandoned piece of machinery, broken but still fixable. Like how do you repair it? So they're both the same inciting event, but they really push the community in different directions. And so after interpreting that card, you have a choice of 3 different options. And they're the 3 choices I said before, basically. You can start a conversation, you can start a project, or you can discover something new, so exploring the horizons. So discussions never result in action. And taking action never involves a conversation. Those are discrete and separate things. And in my experience of community, that is how that functions. Like you will sit around and you will talk and you will talk and you will talk, and eventually someone will say like, cool, great that you're all still talking, I'm gonna do this thing. And then everyone kind of has to like reckon with that.
Have you read Molly Gloss, The Dazzle of Day by any chance? Oh, you
No.
must.
That's a great,
You must go read it. It's a science fiction novel. The entire novel takes place on a generation ship. The people on the ship are Quakers, and the whole novel is a Quaker meeting. Because they have a resource problem. They are not sure whether to land on this planet or not. That everyone's lives are at stake. The stakes are high, but because they're Quakers, the way they deal with it is everyone comes together and sits around and waits for the spirit to move them to speak and say something. And it's such an interesting.
It's a great book.
Yeah, it's beautifully written.
It's such a wonderful rewriting of the sort of generation ship trope, and in general the sort of science fictional, how action happens and how people interact. It's a kind of a breath of fresh air.
It's funny because you would expect it to be boring, and it is so not boring, right? Like it's she does a terrific job of showing you those tense undercurrents.
Yeah, there's high stakes, and
even though everyone is generally pretty gentle with each other, right? So and respectful and making space for people to speak. And it reminds me a little now of, like, as we're having racial equity conversations in my community, there's Rashida Graham Washington is someone who leads some of those conversations, and she is really careful about making space for people to participate, encouraging people to sit with discomfort. I think there's sort of like this larger conversation happening about, like, how do we work towards social justice, or I think Corey talked about human rights when we interviewed him recently, and in a way, like, how do we have those conversations is super interesting to me. In ways that,
I am now regretting that in my introduction I didn't say that Avery is also one of my favorite thinkers about social justice in general, and in particular, like like your Twitter is like one of the main like I sort of feel like the whole conversation about restorative justice, for instance, is something that like now is all over my Twitter feed, but like 3 or 4 years ago it was really something that I was that you we're talking about with such sort of integrity and intellectual honesty, which is not sort of just like, here is the first thought or the most immediate, like yes, this is the pressing and important need, but also we have to take this seriously about what do we do across the board about things. And anyway, very well thought out. So that's another thing. You should all follow Avery on Twitter too. I wanted to pick up on something that you said, which I think is interesting beyond just, we can go back to the quiet year if you want to ask more about it, Marianne, but there's something that you said, which I think goes to the heart of a lot of like what we talked about, what games do for their players, like that they allow the storytelling, but there's also and you alluded, Marianne, I think you said something about that raised my hackles about, like, I don't know, both games and art, or games versus art, which is like, that strikes me as funny because that's like saying both stories and art, or both movies and art, or both comics and art. Like,
well, but can I clarify?
Yeah.
I guess, like,
sure,
I think
sure.
when a lot of people
not
hear
really raised.
Yeah, but I think it's important. Like, when a lot of people hear games, especially like they people who aren't in the community already they'll have an idea of what's meant by that, which is like Monopoly. It's
but
like,
I think Monopoly is art.
well,
I think Monopoly, I'm not saying not all, to say whether something's art or not is not whether it's good or not. Like, there's a lot of crap art. Like, I don't think Monopoly is a very good game or very good art, but Monopoly paints a picture of the world, immerses you in a world with certain rules, makes you feel as if you are a person who operates in a world that has certain rules, and communicates an experience that you enter into. Like,
okay, yes, I'm not going to disagree with any of that, but I would say when, like, my family sat around to play Monopoly as kids, we weren't looking for, creating a new art piece every time we played, right? Like, we wanted to be entertained, and we wanted to win. We wanted to indulge our competitive natures. Like, what we came
but when you sat down to watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you were also not like, now I'm going to counter-read the narrative.
But I do think there's a difference between what we come to different things for, right? And there are types of games that are more mechanical or more about other stuff and more about competitiveness and winning. Like, when I'm sitting and let's make an even simpler one. When I'm playing a war with my sister, where it's literally high card draw, who's winning, right? And who gets the bigger stack of cards. We spent an endless amount of time on this, and it was about the competition, right? And like that was the heart of it. Whereas I feel like Avery's games try to do a lot more than that, is kind of what I'm saying. So
I hear what you're saying. It sounds like what you're saying is, like, the term game is it makes it seem idle or trivial, not something that's going to challenge you on a deeply personal level. It's like a toy. Right. It's a time spender.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's how a lot of people encounter it, right? And so,
and I don't actually think that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I think that one of the great strengths of role-playing games, compared to other things which have the potential to be transformative and invite you to reimagine yourself in a similar kind of capacity. The great thing about role-playing games is that you're not going in with that pressure to do so. The energy and the determination it takes me to enter into like intentional journaling exercises or like life planning exercises or like relationship development workshops is like, it's higher than the amount it takes to sit down and like be like, let's tell a story where we're all like space cowboys. But role-playing games have this way to like really impact you and invite you to see the world differently and invite you to try out different strategies for like relationships and conflict and see what sticks and see what like lights you up. And there's kind of this like element of like sneaky personal development. Like you find the loophole to experience a wider world and to challenge yourself in new ways. And you do so when your defenses are down. And I don't mean to like make that sound like conniving and sinister or anything. No. I just think that there's actually a strength to being like, oh yeah, this is just a game. It's just a game. It's not like personally challenging, transformative, like you're not going to be at like the forge of your own identity or anything like that. Don't worry, it's just a game.
Right.
There's still that potential there, and you can get there in a way where there's like a lot less expectation pressure.
It's one of the, I'll give you another example of how I've been thinking about this. So I was on the board of the Museum of Science and Industry for a little while on their futurist board, and they had us thinking about what exhibits they should do in the next year and how they should present them. And I think museums have been going through this process of really engaging with gamification and what happens when you take static exhibits, kind of old school museum exhibits, and instead bring in kind of an educational but also gamified, fun entertainment element to those. Like, how does that change the visitors' participation in the museum, right? How they end up helping to create the museum with every visitor who comes, right? And you know, another example, I was just thinking, like, I need to do literally today, I've got to get my campaign website up. So I've spent the morning drafting a like my story and like my vision for the high school kind of thing. So I'll put those up, but what I would actually really love to do is also have a little narrative game on the site where people can, you know, click and be assigned like, you know, here you are, this is your circumstances coming into the high school, right? A sort of random generator telling you what your race, economic, disability, et cetera, queerness, all of that gets kind of assigned to you, and then kind of play out some of the things that might happen as you go along. And that obviously, I'm not going to get that done today or this week, and maybe not at all in time for the election in April. But I think I've been thinking a lot about like, how do we get people to engage with these big community issues in a way that is inviting? And I think that's a lot of what games can do, right? Is you know, because they lower the stakes, as you say, as they you know, like, because we have this kind of like taking you back to childhood and play and all of that, maybe that's an opportunity. So I don't know, sorry, that was a long thing, but
I mean, I think people learn really well in a ludic space, right? I mean, and if you think about it, like
what is ludic?
in a space of play, right? When we're playing, like playing is really important, and every animal that has a lot to learn, every animal that the more arbitrary, generative, new behavior, innovative behavior an animal is capable of, the more time it spends playing, right? Like that's what, like evolutionarily, play is for, like learning and becoming.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, that was very
I
highfalutin. What I was gonna say, or when I was gonna ask about the thing that Avery said about the quiet year, and I was gonna want to riff off of that, was that we interrupt each other a lot on this podcast. We don't expect to necessarily you know, go from point A to point B and arrive at point B. That's you know. Anyway, but I wanted to say that the you said something I think is interesting in terms of the game going from so we talked about it from the player perspective. How do you give players the ability to create stories by giving them this scaffolding. But there's sort of the view of the point of view of like, what do you do as a game designer to create that scaffolding? And one thing that I think was interesting is that you said, in the game, you can either be having a conversation or you can be taking action. In my experience in community, that's how that works. And I feel like that insight of like that's how that works. And I'm going to take this thing that I've seen that's how it works, and I'm going to capture that, and essentially by writing the rules of a game, make you do. You know what I mean? I'm telling you, I have observed that one only does one of these two things, and now I'm going to make you do those because I'm writing these rules. And it's interesting to talk a little bit, if you talk a little bit about that, like the kind of choice that you make, which I think is a very powerful aspect in your work, which I have more examples. I could talk more about how that's a powerful aspect of your work, but I'd like to hear you talk about like what do you do to make those choices come alive about what you're communicating to the players about the world that they're playing in, and therefore what you're sort of saying with that constructed space for play.
Yeah, I mean, I think that every aspect of designing and publishing a game works in harmony to communicate that kind of thing to the players, right? I don't think it's just game design or just writing. It's also the art. It's also the like what the book is like in your hands. It's also like everything comes together to create an experience and to impart a worldview. But I think with game design, like mechanics design in particular, one of the things that it does is that when you sit down and you create a model for how the world works in your story, you're implicitly creating a model for how for what you believe is true about how systems work in real life, right? Like a game system is a specific model of power and causality. And even if we're talking about like elves fighting dragons in a mythical realm, like we're still making statements about how power and causality work generally. And I think like a fantasy adventure game like Dungeons and Dragons, its rules have declared that certain people are just better at things than other people. And then the way you get better is that you go off as an individual, fight and kill things, and gain experience and loot. And that allows you to level up. And the power and resources that people have in the world, they have earned by themselves by lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. That's just like what the mechanics do in the game. And there's this model of power in a game like Dungeons and Dragons. It's individual. It is earned. It is decontextualized. You can just go from like one realm to another and just take all your power with you. And so there's all these ideas that are just baked into how the rules work. And a lot of role-playing games, I think, reflect a really liberal individualist worldview. They reflect a capitalist and colonialist worldview. And even if the story that people are telling isn't, or like the story that the game designers are like writing into the words of their game isn't explicitly going there, if the mechanics are about heroes going from one place into like an exotic and dangerous different place and killing the things they find there and then taking all of their resources and then going and fighting additional things elsewhere, like that is a colonialist story, regardless of like what color you paint it, you know? And so a lot of what I try to do in game design is challenge myself to like reflect on like, what are my values? What is my worldview? What am I in political alignment with? And how do I structure stories built around that? And so a lot of my games are experiments on how to design or how to tell stories that aren't about heroes. Because I think that like individual heroes who change the world through discrete individual actions, who have an entirely internal locus of control and power, who earn their power, who use, like, I think we've got enough of those stories that if it is politically meaningful to have them, like, we're covered. And so I really want to work to tell stories where power is relational and contextual and ecological. and I want to explore stories about how systems work and how infrastructure works and how communities work. Because I think we need more of those stories, and because I think it's unexplored terrain. So if I get it right, it'll sell well. But more importantly, because I think it's just like, it reflects how I believe power and change and causality actually do work.
We're hoping to have John Stavropoulos come on the podcast down the line. He said he would, and I want to talk to him about this exactly and how it works at D&D. So that'll be an interesting connection. I do think, and we just had Cory Doctorow here on our show, and he wrote this novel, For the Win, which I don't know if you're familiar, but it's about the Warcraft, World of Warcraft, massive multiplayer online role-playing game, and the thing that happened in our world, which is because of global inequities, people in, say, America who didn't want to go to the effort of grinding their lower level characters paid gold farmers in China to do the grinding for them, like paid them real cash money. And so an entire economy sprung up kind of supporting, you know, Americans having more fun. And you have gold farming sweatshops in China. And his novel deals with all of that in really interesting ways. So just to make some connections here. Maybe you could go and from there though and talk about, I looked at your talk on querying representation, like maybe, and I would sort of connect it to, I'm teaching an intro to lit theory right now, and so, you know, like in a few weeks we're going to be doing queer theory, and it sounded like what you were talking about kind of merges well with that. And I'm thinking about things like Helene Cixous, who is this French theorist who asked questions like, well, if storytelling is based on like male sexual response, like here's a problem, then you rise to a climax, you have the climax, then you fall asleep. What might stories look like? Oh, have you not run into that, Ben? She's great. You know, like if that's been the model for what makes a good story, what would stories look like if you model them on female sexual response, right? Maybe a much more convoluted path with a lot of peaks, you know, and doubling back, and who knows. So I don't know if that's a good lead in or not for your talk, but maybe you could maybe you could connect
great
it.
Lead in to
Okay.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a talk that I've iterated on and given a few times for the past 8 years, I guess. Mm-hmm. But it's really about the thing that I was just talking about, I guess. That I think game mechanics are inherently political, because I think game systems model and reflect and reify real world systems. What you choose to highlight, what you choose to hard code into the game that you're designing. Like in order for someone to sit down and play that game, they need to, on some level, buy into those conceits. Right? Like I can't sit down and play Dungeons and Dragons and be like, I mean, I think power is like a really contextualized and embedded thing. And I think that like the notion of a hero is kind of incoherent, but I'll just play this anyways. Like I need to, on some level, for the game to make any sense and for me to get any enjoyment out of it, like buy in for at least those hours when I'm at the table. And similarly, you can't sit down and play The Quiet Year and be like, there's always enough time for talking and action and exploration. We just need to like, you know, like find the, you can't, because The Quiet Year is like, listen, fundamentally there's a scarcity, it is time, and you need to figure out how trust works in your community through mistakes. Go. Mm-hmm. Like you need to buy into that to play the game. So, talking about the fact that game systems and game mechanics are inherently political, and that they they implicitly tell a story that represents like a certain worldview. This talk kind of acknowledged that throughout the history of tabletop role-playing game design, we've largely been playing straight white men's stories on an infrastructural level, regardless of who our characters are. And I guess I kind of challenged that isn't enough to think about representation in role-playing games in terms of like, are there diverse genders and races on the cover of the book? Because if we have a game that is like fundamentally modeled around straight white men's access to power, and then we say, but in the revised edition, like we have a Black woman on the cover doing the exact same things in the exact same ways the straight white man did. Like, I don't think we're necessarily telling a fundamentally different story. That level of kind of visual or textual representation is important, and it can like be life-changing for people when they see it. But a role-playing game book, like it isn't an art book, it isn't a coffee table book, right? It's rules for play. And so the representation needs to live at that level. It needs to live in the rules and in the play. And if it doesn't, then we're just talking about like applying new coats of paint to the same machine, right?
Yeah.
And so this talk, yeah, it challenged us to look at the engines of play, the mechanics, the systems, and ask, what does it look like to have representation on a mechanical level? And specifically for queerness, it was saying like, it isn't enough to just put a gay in your game, right? You need to look at the models and the rules that are operating in the game and ask like, how much are these reflective of a straight worldview? How much do these actually like reflect like queer world making as it exists in the real world?
And like not just a straight worldview, but like a very specifically like a straight worldview that's tied to financial systems and cultural systems of how property gets passed down and enforces marriage and all of that, right? And I'm thinking of your game, A Place to Fuck Each Other. So maybe if you could tell viewers about that a little bit. And I thought that was fascinating. I totally wanted to play.
Yeah. Okay. So Place to Fuck Each Other is a game for 3 players. So in the first scene, 2 players are playing lovers, and this is a game about like lesbian relationship and community drama. So 2 players are the lovers, and these lovers are either hooking up together or moving in together, which are the 2 stages of a lesbian relationship, which can happen in any order. And then the third player is playing the third, who is kind of like in an abstract way represents all of the ways that the world at large kind of imposes itself upon this relationship. And so the scene involves like these 2 lovers, kind of the people playing them like identify like what these 2 people would need to feel like perfectly at home, and like everything was dialed in this relationship, and it was really working, and like all their needs were met, and they felt safe, and they felt nourished, and they felt like sexy, and everything felt like charged up in all the right ways. And then the person playing the third looks at that list of 4 things and just crosses one out. And was like,
no.
You don't get that. Like, I get that it would feel really great right now if you had like a private space, like no one frantically calling you at 2 a.m. If there was like some nice music playing in the background, and like you both felt like a lot of security because there had been no violence in your night. So out of those 4, like great, people are calling you at 2 a.m. We're just going to like cross that one out. You don't get that. You don't get that reprieve, and we're going to put another one on thin ice. So right away, there's a kind of an exploration of how in dyke relationships, so frequently people in these communities are lacking the basic material resources and safety they need for their relationships to flourish. And so that's represented in this really like awkwardly always there kind of way, by just being like, great, what do we need for this to be a beautiful moment? And we get 3/4 of that. And so you play out the scene until one of the 2 realizes like, I shouldn't be here right now. The scene ends and then the roles rotate. So now, right, if me and Benjamin were the lovers, then suddenly it's you 2 are the lovers, and I'm playing the third. So now I get to be the people like honking outside of the apartment or whatever it might be. And out of those characters that we've established so far, we follow one of them into their next relationship. And so we invent another character. And then we'll keep on always using at least one pre-existing character, but always exploring new relationships. And as we go, we're developing this web of all these like, well, we've hooked up and these two have moved in together and these two are broken up and these two aren't speaking together. And so, I mean, the L word has this really classic relationship diagram, and you build that throughout the game.
Yeah.
But yeah, rather than being a story about any single relationship, it's a story about how in a tight-knit insular community, relationships end up becoming densely interdependent and historied from one another. And ultimately, like, your relationship is structured by the queer community that exists around it in a way that when you show up to the relationship, like, it's already largely predetermined.
I mean, what's interesting, another thing that's interesting about that is that, you know, it's not as if straight communities don't have a lot of that as well, right? It's just that it gets denied and hidden in ways because of, you know, compulsory heterosexuality and the ways in, you know, in which it is tied to property and economics and who fathered whose children, right? Like, so, you know, you look at a movie like Steel Magnolias, like there's a lot of great art exploring how the real story is much more complex than the Disney narrative. And I think it's been really fascinating watching the Disney movies with Frozen, et cetera, kind of like moving away from that narrative and, you know, starting to queer it, to mess with it in various ways. I don't know if you guys watched Frozen and Frozen 2, but they did really cool things with it. So, so, all right. Ben, do you want to throw in anything? We can redirect, but I didn't want to cut you off.
Well, no, that's cool. You didn't cut me off. I mean, I love that. I guess one thing I want to share more than really anything else is that I just thought I should throw this in there while we're on this topic. Because it's also about talking about how games constrain and communicate, and also how one of the things you talk about in the talk is sort of leveling up. I mean, sort of we've gone over this a bunch of times, but like one of the things that's at the heart of a lot of role-playing games is like, so then how do you, there's a static number of things that you can do, and then how does that change over time, or how do you grow and change? And like one sort of example of sort of a classically heteronormative narrative is the kind of like, I now can do more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. Like I'm, and so I mean, there's different, and as you point out, like through murder, you know, murdering people and taking their stuff, like you get more powerful. But the thing I wanted to share is, so Monster Hearts, which is the first game of yours that I played and fell in love with, and really I fell in love with it before I played it. And in fact, the only time I think I have burst out crying reading certainly a role-playing instruction manual, but probably like an instructional manual of any kind. Like, I don't think I have any other experience of reading a instructional manual about how to do something that I haven't even done yet and bursting out crying is the page about the growing up moves in Monster Hearts, which is just the most brilliant take on what advancement, what it would mean to advance. So in Monster Hearts is a game in which it's teenage monsters, you know, messy teenage monsters having complicated lives and falling in love and turning each other on and shutting each other down, and it is in some ways a more conventional game. Like in some ways, Monster Hearts is among the more traditional of all of your games, in the sense that there is a GM, there are players, the players each play one character, the characters have stats, they roll to do stuff. And so in some ways it's very close to some of the more traditional, you know, dice, you know, polyhedral dice games. Well, they're not polyhedral because it's a Powered by the Apocalypse game, so it's just 2d6. But anyway, but it does really interesting things within that framework to kind of push the envelope of what that means. And so the way you gain abilities to do things as you, in Monster Hearts 2, as you fail, which is an interesting model of how you learn, right? As opposed to by taking stuff and winning, you learn by failing. And as you learn by failing, one of the things that's so beautiful is how constrained you are, because you are a teenager and a monster, and the game is defined to make your relationships initially be pretty dysfunctional. Like the things you know how to do are like to shut people down, turn them on, or lash out, or run away. Like that's kind of your skill set. And and there's all this. And I've played Monster Hearts recently with people, and they're like, "Can I just like sort of talk this person into and make them?" And I was like, "No, that's a growing up move. Like there's a when you failed enough, you start to unlock these moves where you can like actually call someone on their shit or make them feel beautiful or like resolve conflicts in this really. And it's this just really powerful metaphor for like how confusing it is to be a teenager and what you learn in that process. I don't know. So I would love to hear a little bit about like, I mean, so Monster Hearts was something I think you did pretty early. It is a more traditional game, and then you came back to it and revised it, much to everyone's delight. But it is very different than some of the other games. And I think it has these. I think it's has made lasting contributions to the genre. And in particular, I think that same thing you were talking about like you can either like in the Quiet Year where you can either talk or take action. There's a bunch of stuff in Monster Hearts where even though it superficially seems like a very much like you roll dice, you do what you want, that constrains what players can do or alters their expectations in ways that are really powerful. So anyway, I'm interested in your thinking on that and also like how it's evolved since, lately. I mean, if you think differently than you did, years ago or.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because in Monster Hearts, I don't think the moves, which is like when you roll dice and interact with the rules, I don't think it actually constrains what the players can do. If the players are like, my teenager is just going to try and just talk it out with you and reach like a sensible, harmonious conclusion, and we're just going to like, build relational strength. Like you can theoretically do that. But then there's these moves that are like, also, just anytime you want to engage in violence to get power over people, you can just do these things to do that. And theoretically, one could just avoid that temptation. Theoretically, a high schooler could avoid the temptation to lash out at others, be mean and catty, like weaponize their own identity, and they could just like rise above all that. But are others ever going to do that same thing in return for them? And the answer often is like no. When people feel powerless, they like lash out and they do anything they can to get power. And that's kind of in a lot of ways Monster Hearts' framing of what high school is a lot of the time. And so you're right. There's these growing up moves, and they kind of all the different ways you can gain experience and kind of advance your character on a mechanical level. Like there's these growing up moves which represent like here are specific tools you can use to stop the cycle of violence. And in terms of other advancements, they're all about how to enhance your ability to enact the cycle of violence. So theoretically, one can totally rise above this pressure cooker situation that really has you thinking about like how to claw your way towards power in every relationship and in every like social interaction. But it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that when the temptation is like when you have this character sheet that's just like, by the way, if you want to hurt somebody, like deeply hurt them on an emotional level, like here's your option.
You get to roll.
And if you don't want to do that, that's cool, I guess.
And it's right, and it's which is yes, that is so much better than what I said. It's not that you're constrained to act like in a dysfunctional way. It's that you're afforded. It's that the game you're offered mechanical support for doing so. You could take the higher road. It's sort of arduous, and there's no, and I think that is also how games like just the fact that you tactilely get to pick up dice and roll. When if you wanna take the higher road and just talk this out with the person, we can do that for a while, and then I don't know, maybe the GM will think of something else to do. But if you wanna say something cutting that will hurt their feelings and ruin their reputation, there's these dice which I will slide across the table to you. Like that actually models, as you said. I mean, the structure of the game models better. It's not that you can't. It's that this is the road which offers support. But then there are other things in Monster Hearts which strike me as very brave in terms of how it's constructed, in terms of constraining player agency. So two obvious examples where So, those aren't things that are off the table that you can't do. But there's two obvious examples. One thing is the darkest self, which is such an interesting innovation, where since you're a monster, at some point through various things that could happen, like as a way of if you're on the brink of death, or if you get hurt enough in some ways or whatever, you can become your darkest self, which is sort of something that I never saw before this in role-playing games. I don't know if maybe if this is the first time it occurred, but there's a little script for like, now we are constraining kind of the narrative space of your character, and I'm telling you this little script for like, this is what you're like now. Like, screw these people, you're going to lash out, you're just, you're gonna tear through everything in sight if you're the werewolf, and each one is different for the characters. But that is this, in a sense, very, very bold constraining of player agency in a way that I think in traditional games, it's just like, well, the GM says what happens in the world and you say what you do. And for the game to be like, no, now you're in this mode and you get out of it when, there's always a getting out of it, like when someone forgives you and you see the harm you've done, whatever, just like a narratively appropriate. Those are so beautiful. And the other thing, of course, famously, I think this is one of the things that gets talked about a lot about Monster Hearts, is the narrative constraint that if somebody else playing another character rolls to turn your character on and succeeds, then you are turned on narratively. So that is also sort of an intrusion where it's like, you can't just decide to play there are new rules for asexual play in the Monster Hearts 2, but you can't just decide to play a straight character and not get turned on by somebody, of the same gender, because if they roll, you will. So you can decide what you want to do about it, but your experience of sexuality, this is very evocative of being a teenager, is like being impinged upon from outside by like things you don't entirely understand or have control of. So anyway, those are like, narrative constraint is also, I think, a big part of it in innovative ways, I think.
Yeah, I think that one of the goals of Monster Hearts is to have the choice about what your character does kind of come in at a different point than it does in a lot of role-playing games. Like you said with sexuality, a lot of how it works in stories in Monster Hearts is like, listen, you ultimately are responsible for what you do next. But like, how you feel, what's going on inside your body, like that is entirely outside of the scope of your control, because you are confused, closeted, scared teenager. You have raging hormones, and that's not to say that you aren't capable of deep and immense thought. That's not to say you aren't capable of acting strategically, but like, you have a lot of things that you are discovering about yourself in every moment of play, and you have to just figure out what you do with that information. So yeah, like you can be Brad the football player who's totally straight. That doesn't mean you're not going to get turned on in the locker room. That means that you're internalizing what that signifies for you in a different way than some of the other people in that locker room might.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's and with the darkest self, there's throughout all of the play of Monster Hearts, you kind of have this two-faced quality to your character, where you are both like a regular teenager dealing with regular problems, and also like a vampire dealing with vampire problems, or werewolf dealing with werewolf problems. And there's like this, like, you're a monster, but like in a metaphorical way, in the metaphorical way in which all teenagers are monsters. But Darkest Self is like this moment, like something like a switch got flipped, and this is like it's not really the like demand to, but as much as it is the invitation to just go full monster, right? It's like, listen, we get this throughout this whole story. You, the werewolf, have been like struggling to contain your like primal aggression. You've been like looking for opportunities to vent a lot of your feelings so you don't have to think about what they signify. So, like, and here's the moment where you like, you rip into like giant wolf form and you eat people. Go. Yeah, like often because there's this like pressure cooker of trying to maintain control over yourself in like the heart of the story and how the game mechanics function. When that darkest self comes up, it is more like an invitation to go no holds barred in like exploring that monstrosity, rather than like, oh no, I'm getting punished, I'm in the bad zone where I'm evil. It's like, yes, finally I can like let go of these shackles.
That invitation is such an interesting framing to me of, because originally I think when you were talking about game mechanics, I had a little resistance because I was feeling like they're almost not consensual, right? Like there is a way in which like the game is forcing you to make these kinds of choices because of the way the mechanics are set up. But the consent happens when you decide to play the game. You can always not play the game, right? And so when you play the game, you are kind of like entering yourself into this experiment where you are going to keep being invited in various directions, right? And then you can decide how far you want to go in it. It's making me think about, so I've so far only written one very tiny RPG that was modeled on your Dreams Askew, Dream Apart to some extent. So I'm planning to take us there next, talking about those projects. But I was very resistant to putting anything related to mechanics in there. And I think part of it was a kind of like, I'm forcing the characters to do this because of the roll of the dice. And in the end, the only thing I have in there right now is that, it's sci-fi. There's a universe with a war that is developing. And so every round between rounds, they roll a die to determine how likely it is that the war is going to affect what happens in the next scene. And that's it for mechanics, right? And as you were talking, I was just thinking like I could escalate it, right? So that like first round, it's like 1 out of 6 means the war escalates, 2 out of 6, 3 out of 6. And then by the end, if you're still playing 6 scenes in, the war will affect you. And I may do that because I think my motivation for this piece was a lot thinking about everyday people trying to live their lives and then war descending on them, and based on what happened in Sri Lanka to my relatives and so on. So I don't know. I'm kind of throwing out there like the consent piece of it is interesting to me. As I am like, I mean, D&D is so constrained, like all the mechanics are so defined that, when I've tried GMing, and I taught a year ago, when we were still in person, I taught my son's 5th grade class in after school, like how to design a role-playing game, right? So I taught them D&D first, and then we played through some, and like I hate being GM as D&D in D&D because there's so much counting and mechanics and there's so much structure to it. I get no pleasure out of any of that. And with the 10-year-olds, I could just throw it all away and like choose the most dramatic thing to happen next, right? And I think probably good GMs do that kind of thing a lot. But I don't know, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about mechanics, and then I want to shift us to Dream Apart, Dream Askew. So
yeah, I think consent is an interesting question. And since we're kind of springboarding off of Monster Hearts, I want to mention that like a big part of the game is that there are what are called like safety tools, which is like ways to put the brakes on and be like, whoa, I actually don't want to go there, like narratively. And there are ways to be able to like, I'm going to press this button and we are going to gracefully detour into a different story, because like this is not really comfortable or appropriate, or like it's hitting upon something triggering or just icky, so we're not going there. And so that's baked into a lot of games. And I think the more fraught the narrative terrain that you're exploring is, the more important it is. But talking about like the idea that mechanics, that like the rules of the game kind of pose a consent issue, I feel like that's in a way like akin to saying like a cookbook imposes consent issues. Because I mean, but I think like when you let someone loose in the kitchen and you just say like, cook whatever, or like, here's some pistachios, go wild, cook anything you want for dinner, just here's some pistachios to incorporate. Like most people struggle with that.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you this surprise. So I wrote a cookbook last year, and one of the things that really shocked me was people hate it when you say salt to taste at the end of a recipe, it turns out. And I'm like, and I was so startled by this because that seems like a very intuitive, like you're making a curry, it's easy to it's not like bread, right? Like you can put your hand in the pot and taste it and decide if it needs more salt or not. But novice cooks want a guideline. They want to say, I use half a teaspoon or a teaspoon or 2 teaspoons, and then they can usually modify from there, but they need a starting point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in role-playing games, like I have almost never met a group of people who sit down and then don't modify the rules as they go. They don't, like anytime that I write a game that's good for 3 to 7 people, I'll always say it's good for 3 to 6 people. Anytime I write a game that's good for up to 5 people, I always say it's good for up to 4 people, because no matter what I write, we're gonna be like,
They'll
I'm sure you
squeeze
can
in
handle
more.
a couple extra players. I won't go wrong. And so I'm always cognizant of the fact that people are going to take it and make it their own, which I think is good.
Right.
But I think people have this notion of themselves as really craving freedom to choose anything and go anywhere. And in short bursts, it might be true that that is really liberating, but in long stretches, I think it is mostly exhausting for people. Most people, I think, love rules significantly more than they are willing to admit. And like, it took me a long time to realize like that is true for me as well. It's just that I am deeply critical of a lot of the institutions of power that regulate a lot of the rules in our society. So like good rules, best practices, right? Like ways of articulating principles on the ground that I believe in. Like I love that stuff. I love knowing how to do things right. And like I brought up cooking earlier, like learning how to like do a technical skill more efficiently. Learning that like with soft necked garlic bulbs, you can just kind of like mallet the entire bulb and then just pick the pieces out, and it'll like save you so much time compared to like individually peeling them all with your fingers. Like you should never have to do that motion with garlic, you know? And so like learning like here are the rules for how to do something well, I think is actually really empowering for people. And similarly with a role-playing game, like if there are like, here are the rules and the prompts and the guidelines for telling a really evocative story of this nature. And if you want to tell a story of this nature, you pick up this game, you sit down, you engage with the rules in creative ways, you're gonna produce something excellent and fun and engaging. Like people actually love that. And if there's too many rules, or if the rules don't do what they say they're gonna do, if the promise is unfulfilled, that can be really frustrating, and then the rules can feel like they're really bogging you down. So like good rules inspire people to like engage well, I feel like.
No, I love that.
I mean, I having also read the draft of your game, when you say that's the only mechanic, I think you're looking at it through the framework of like, well, you roll dice then, so that's a mechanic. But like, really, a game is made of mechanics. You know what I mean? Like that's what, like, of course, there's
so what,
sometimes
like
mechanics are expressed through evocative prompts or whatever. But insofar as it's the games we're talking about are operating on a level of both instructions for what people should do and also fiction. But the fiction is, you know, you can if you just write a vignette that says if you just write a bunch of backstory information, that's not necessarily mechanics, but it's also not a game yet.
But when
like you have to start telling people what to do.
So you're saying like when I tell people you are part of a crew of a spaceship, that's a mechanic, you would say? Like you're on this ship together?
I mean, in some sense, part of well, I don't know. Like that's actually really interesting to unpack, right? Like so so in that sentence, crew of a spaceship is backstory, it's fiction, right? That's what we're envisioning, a crew of a spaceship. But you are part is in a way like already telling me something about how you're going to interact. Like what does it mean? Like but I think there's this sort of what is happening in the world of the game and what is happening at the table and how are they connected is what the game is made of. You know what I mean? And sort of like you know, because when you know, like if you hand somebody a deck of cards and say play, it's like that, you know what I mean? It's like, well, there's and they say, how do you play? And say, well, there's kings and there's queens, there's jacks and there's a 10. That, you know, there have to be some actions that are taken, and I mean, there's this notion of crunchiness, right? Of like, how much math are you doing? How many times? How many tables are you looking up? How many days? But in a way, like maybe this is a good segue to Dream Apart and Dream Askew. Dream Apart and Dream Askew, very not crunchy. No dice. There's essentially circling things and taking tokens and putting tokens back are the physical, arguably less crunchy than Quiet Year, which has the deck of cards and like a map to draw. Like there's even less stuff, but in the concept in the process of making it, like it's each one of the little prompts, like the size of a move, the ways in which like the game has things you can do, weak and strong and normal moves, and the it was a huge learning process going through drafts of this and going back and forth with Avery, and like just I'm thinking of like the refinements I did from like my initial idea for a sentence to like what ended up in it, like the series of steps, and like with Avery's guidance partly, and like the way that each of those phrases has to be like constrained enough, not constrained enough. You don't want to ask a question that's a yes or no question. You want something, they have to be constructed so that you're starting something that's going to snowball with somebody else's thing. And the ways that, so there's no dice, but mechanics in terms of like, the fact that this person has this move implies something about the economy of moves and what this other person can do. That, you know what I mean? Like in a way, the game is made of mechanics. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's okay. We're going to pause because we're trying to remember to take breaks. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we're going to come back and talk about, I'd like to talk about how you guys started working on Dream Apart, Dream Askew, and go from there into just talking about like, okay, you've written a game, like what do you do with it next, right? So, but I will say, before we pause, that the first time I taught a class, I was a TA in grad school in my master's program, and my professor said, "Do you want to teach this class?" And I said, "Sure." And he's like, "Okay, it's Eliot. Prepare, teach it next week." And I had not read any Eliot at that point, and so I called up my high school English teacher and I said, and she talked me through some stuff that I could say to the students. So then I came in and taught the class. I ran out of material pretty quickly because I was talking too fast. So in a 50-minute class, I raced through in like 22 minutes, but I'd allowed time for questions, right? So then I started asking them questions, but all the questions I asked had yes, no answers. And so that also took no time. And so at like 30 minutes into the class, I had nothing left to say. They're staring at me, and the professor rescues me, comes down and takes over the class. It was horrible, worst teaching experience ever. And so there's my little anecdote about the danger of yes, no questions when you're trying to get open-ended conversation going. So, okay, we're taking 5 now. Marianne Monraj, Benjamin Rosenbaum, talking to Avery Alder about RPGs, role-playing games. And I'm going to ask Ben and Avery to talk about the RPGs they wrote together. Maybe you can clarify that a little bit. And they ran a Kickstarter for Dream Apart and Dream Askew. And I will say I was one of the playtesters for Ben's game, and I think I played it twice in early forms and had a lot of fun with it. So I love it. So yeah, how did you guys end up working on this? Tell us about the games.
Well, I think maybe I'll start since I have the first chapter of this story. I encountered this game called Apocalypse World by D. Vincent Baker and McGay Baker in 2010. And Apocalypse World was really exciting. It was about these weird badasses in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, kind of in community together. They have messy relationships. They're having to like get involved in fights, in dangerous situations. They're having to figure out like how to hold the world together. And yeah, it was really cool. The mechanics were really interesting. They really put an emphasis on these kind of messy, complicated partial successes and like trade-offs and complications. And that was really exciting. Like that really differed from a lot of game design that came before it, which was really like pass-fail oriented in terms of like mechanics telling you either like, great, you succeed, or like, sorry, you botched that one. But like Apocalypse World really had like, there's hard choices and there's there's tensions in that middle ground as like a driving part of the mechanics. And I really liked it. And at the time, or shortly afterwards, in 2012, 2013, I was running a weekly drop-in games night in kind of the community in Vancouver. And there was a big emphasis on welcoming queer players, a big emphasis on welcoming people who are totally new to role-playing, and just kind of creating a different audience and context for playing role-playing games, often for the first time. And I was really excited about Apocalypse World, and I brought it to this group and tried to run it in that context. And in a lot of ways, it was successful, but I kept on encountering like, this doesn't quite work in this like 3.5 hour compressed time frame with people who have never played role-playing games before. It really needs more space to breathe. And so I started tinkering and eventually designed my own game, Dream Askew, that was that took some of the same setting elements from Apocalypse World, but instead of being like you're badasses to get into battles in the wasteland, it was much more focused on like you're a community of like flailing queers who have to band together to try and like make it now that society has abandoned you and is slowly collapsing. And so to make it more accessible for the specific context that I was playing games in at the time, I took away a lot of the math and a lot of the kind of intricacy and fiddliness of some of the mechanics, and really focused on like what I loved about the engine of play, which was that tempo of like sometimes you like succeed in amazing, dazzling ways, sometimes you fail in catastrophic and complicated ways, but a lot of the time you have that like middle zone of trade-offs and complications. And so that developed into this game that was revolved around like you have 3 sets of moves. Anytime you can make a normal move. Anytime you want to, you can make a weak move, and when you do that, you get a token. And later you can spend a token to make a strong move. So then you have these people who are like trying to take care of and build their community, who are like getting high at the worst possible moment, who are giving away like the secrets of their like community security structures, who are like stealing from one another because they're doing all these things to get these tokens, so that later when like disaster falls upon the community because of like their bad choices, they can then spend those tokens to heroically save the day. And so it creates this really great tempo of play. And so yeah, that became Dream Askew, which is my game of queer community drama in the apocalypse. And I put out a short prototype version of that. It was like 13 pages. I released it over Patreon. That was in 2013. And I was like, great, that project is done forever.
Okay. Well, my story begins actually in parallel, because I have to talk about the predecessor to Dream Apart. I'll begin at the beginning. So I played D&D when I was like 7 or 9, like in the 70s. This was when it was a blue book, and by 12 I was like a hipster who like scorned D&D. Like, this is 1981. I like scorned D&D because of all the like terror. I could go on a long rant when I was 12, and I was playing RuneQuest and then Call of Cthulhu, and then I don't know, like a bunch of other 80s games. And then after college, like I didn't really play anymore in college except with a few old friends. We always played the same thing, and we had sort of prided ourselves. I think you said this earlier. Like, there were lots and lots of rules, but as we got better, we were like, well, those rules are just sort of scaffolding. We're going to throw them away and just tell stories. Like, now that we're on a roll and we know these characters, we don't even need to roll dice. We'll just make up what happens. And so we would just play freeform. And I had this idea in my head, my very snobby hipster kid, that like that was the apex that you ascend. Eventually, you transcend these petty rules and you just like make up stuff, and that's this blissful space. And then I didn't play for a while. Then my kids were little, and I tried to get my daughter to play games, and in fact, I once actually wrote her a game which is because it had things that she liked in it. It was a karaoke game, so you could sing. That the mechanic of resolution is you sing. I'm still hoping to do something with this game at some point. But anyway, she was like, "That's a nice try." She played it once. She was like, "That's very nice. It's very sweet of you that you tried to make a game of it." Like, but anyway, my son got into it, and I decided to take him through the stages. Like we played D&D and then we played RuneQuest, and then I was like, I wonder what's out there now. So this was when I Googled and I found all of the new games that have happened in this century, like Fiasco and Apocalypse World, which blew my mind. And Apocalypse World in particular, I mean, all the things that Avery said about it fascinated me. And in addition, Apocalypse World is the the Velvet Underground first album of indie role-playing games, in the sense that it said that everybody who listened to the Velvet Underground's first album like went home and started a band. Like, so it's sort of like everybody started, because one of the things it did was it had this very elegant account of how a role-playing game is a conversation. It's set in a particular setting, and you create moves, which are the mechanics that support the kinds of things that happen in that genre. And so the way you make this, it was atomic. Like in D&D, every single thing you do is a different, like rolling to convince someone is one kind of thing, breaking down a door is another kind of thing. There's a random encounter table. I don't know, there's like a million different mechanics. This simplified everything into, when this happens in the fiction, it triggers this move, and you either roll dice or not, and then there are these three options basically of that Avery mentioned, right? So it made everything modular, and you could kind of swap out pieces and swap them in. So the first wave of Apocalypse World hacks, it encouraged you to hack it. It was hugely hackable. So it, like, I think quite intentionally, spawned this huge universe of like hacks of Apocalypse World, of which there are umpteen gazillions now. Now, the interesting thing about Dream Askew is that almost all of these hacks took the basic mechanics, left them alone, 2d6, 10 and more is a success, 6 and under is a fail, in the middle is a hard choice, and then swapped out the setting. It's like, oh, Apocalypse World, except in Dungeons & Dragons. Apocalypse World, except in space. Apocalypse World, except in, right? And Dream Askew is interesting because it actually sort of takes the setting and queers it, and yes, sort of nerfs the people from badasses to flailing, community people trying to figure things out, but inverts the system, like transforms the system. So it's actually kind of 90 degrees to all of the other Apocalypse World hacks. Anyway, and I love that about it. But in parallel to Avery's part of the story, when I found this, I was like, this is amazing. So I, of course, started fooling around with Apocalypse World hacks.
Is that Shtetl World then?
Yes. So this brings us to Shtetl World.
Okay.
So, and I had an itch I had always wanted to scratch, which is, everybody, I mean, you have this sort of experience of representation of you, and in this case, mechanics, of you play something and it doesn't quite, you know what I mean? It doesn't, it's not really for you. And I mean, as a white guy, there are lots of things in the world that like feel like they're for me, but there's something very specific about D&D that it is there are paladins. Like, it is a very medieval Christian world. And I have this essay in Dream Apart about it's like, I would play that game, but I would know that I was not on the right side of the sword in this scenario. Like, I was not the guy going, like, the lawful good people were not my friends, like that, so and there was a way in which it's this very, I mean, in D&D is intentionally like the Christianity is scraped off, and I mean, apropos representation versus deeper structure, the Christianity is scraped off. Everybody worships random gods with wacky names that are like, appropriated from wherever or made up for the purpose of the monster manual. They're literally statted out of the monster manual, but nonetheless, they're like clerics. They have holy water. It's medieval Christendom, right? And so, one of the reasons I actually liked RuneQuest was that it's like Bronze Age, so it's like before all that. Anyway, so I realized that what I was sort of looking for was like a Jewish game. And I have to say that when I first started the idea of the project, that sounds like a joke. Like, it sounded like kind of a Mel Brooks movie. You know what I mean? Like, it's I don't know, like it's like, we'll be accountants. Like, I don't know, like it sounded, my internalized anti-Jewish oppression, like, it makes it seem ridiculous. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, there's this whole world of tales like Isaac Bashevis Singer and Shalom Aleichem and Yentl and Fiddler on the Roof and everything, in which that's not how you don't win by, you don't have the swords, and you don't win by going and like defeating the evil. And in fact, you probably can't necessarily defeat the evil. You know what I mean? You can outsmart it. You can provisionally rally support from somewhere. You can get in touch with the mystery and magic of the world. But like, a lot of you're surviving is a win. You know what I mean? The default state of D&D is like, clearly, if you went in there and you didn't kill anything, you didn't get any monsters, you just got out alive, that's not a successful D&D campaign. But like, for Jews in medieval Europe, I feel, or like in this case, early modern Europe, I feel like the bar is like, survival is a win. Like, that's like, we got out of this alive. That's a win. So anyway, I just was craving that kind of thing, and I started making a Apocalypse World hack, and it was quite crunchy, and it had dreidels instead of dice, and I was inventing all these wacky mechanics involving dreidels and working out the probabilities and whatever. And I reached a point where I realized this is never actually going to happen because I have bitten off so much work here, and as a novice game designer, like there's so many moving pieces. I was like, the playtest, this is going to be like 10 years I won't, and I was just sort of depressed about it.
Well, and then can I pause too and say so I
play tested that.
I play tested
a version of that,
Shtetl World, right? And I mean I love the concept of the dreidels, but just for anyone listening who's like, oh, I want to do something based on my cultural ethnic heritage, one of the things we ran into as players that was very difficult is there was all of this Jewish language culture stuff that we didn't know, most of us, and it was a huge barrier, right, to getting to actually play the game, and it was very challenging for you to figure out, like, how do you give us access to this sufficiently that we can have a fast start and be playing, rather than sending us off to, like, you know, read 30 pages of, you know, reference materials.
I got Shtetl World to the point where it was a fun game to play with a very patient group of people and me. Like literally I had to be there. Anyway, so then I came upon, as Avery mentioned, like the play kit version of Dream Askew that was on the internet. And I was like, wow, like first of all, there's such a beautiful gem of a thing that in 13 pages it evokes this whole world, like rich world and beautifully designed game. And also I was like struck by the parallels. Like you have this little community that has its own specific identity and has all this internal conflict and tension within it, and it's messy and imperfect, but also they're kind of ultimately united because, if only because they're sort of marginal, both because of the beauty that is found in their shared culture and also because they're kind of marginalized by the outside world. And there's sort of these, you know, other spaces in the world, the sort of like, you know, wild dangerousness and the sort of, you know, strange, like there's essentially the psychic maelstrom internet digital realm that's like this thing that constrains and conditions and interacts with them. And then there's like the normative society that's like this bigger thing that could crush them if it paid attention to them. And, you know, they're living in tension with all these things. And I was like, wow, this like basically maps 1-to-1. Like I could basically like the digital realm is the texts and traditions and the, you know, the outlying gangs is the wild forest. And like, you know, this is basically, I could take this, you know, huge, bulky, like massive amount of lore that I'd stuffed into the dreidel game and like, just use that and try to see which piece of Dream Askew would work with which piece of each of these. And so I just played around with it. I got excited about it. And then at some point I was like, well, I didn't know anything about the cultural traditions of like indie game design and how that works.
Right.
Coming out of like as a short story writer, I was like, well, if this is sort of, I should probably do this. It's a derivative work. I should license it. So I think my initial question would probably land on Avery is a little odd. Coming out of a space where like everybody sort of hacks everybody else's game and like that's a part of the tradition. I was like, what would you charge to license this? Which is not like necessarily a question you ask as an indie gamer, but it would be if it was a piece of fiction and I was just gonna like, can I write a sequel to your novel? Like, I mean, that would be a different kind of question. Anyway, so
So that's how you got in touch, was starting that. Okay.
Yeah, so I emailed Avery and I was like, I have this thing. And I don't know, I'm going to turn it over to Avery, but I have one thing to say, which is that Avery asked a wonderful question, which was like, it was clear that Avery took this request very seriously in lots of good ways. And one of the first things that Avery asked was like, are you Jewish? And what is your, like, very important question. And I was like, yes, I run the committee I run the religious committee of my synagogue, so I nailed that one. But anyway, back over.
Well, and I'm going to say we're going to try and not keep Avery to get forever, so we have 15 minutes.
Sorry,
and here are the no, you're good. You're good. But where I'm going to just direct what I'd love to have you guys talk about is. You know, sort of what the process is for taking this game that you've created. Like, let's say we've done all the game development stuff. It's, you know, on our own. what are the next steps for, like, here's a baby game designer? So I've now written an RPG. I've put it out on my Patreon, but I don't actually know whether there's anyone on my Patreon who plays games. So I'm like, well, I sent it to them, but who knows? I'd like to find some actual play testers, like people who do RPGs who might test this. Where do I go? How does this get published? Is there a convention I should go to, etc.? Are there online communities I should be joining?
Yeah.
You know,
Okay,
are there like regular Zoom sessions where people get together to play RPGs? Because I might be interested in that. So
yeah, I feel like there's a couple different answers. So I feel like the first question you're asking is like, how do I connect with people to play this game?
mhm.
And I think number one is just like talk to your friends, because I think one of the first things you should be making sure you do when you design a game is designing it to actually play it, like you personally,
Mhm.
right? And so designing, like think about who you want to play it with and design it to play it with those people and play it with those people. And if it happens to sing and you happen to be like, this is awesome, I want to take this to more people, like that's great.
Yeah.
But like, I think a lot of the time people begin designing games for like the audience,
Hmm.
like this fictional theoretical future audience that they will have. When like really it's like, first and foremost, this is something you play, so you should design this for the people you plan to play it with personally. And if there's a wider audience than those like four-ish people, like that is excellent.
Okay.
I think that
So
beyond it,
I skipped that step. So like I went to I didn't try to do that. Instead, I have played it twice at a convention and once at my house with a bunch of people who are mostly strangers to me. They all liked it and wanted to keep playing, so that gives me hope. But that's
yeah, I
where
mean,
so
so
that
I mean, I think that's always a step you can go back to. I think
okay.
you can always go back to like reach out to your friends and see if they want to hang
Yeah.
out and play a game with you.
Okay.
Because that's the most exciting step. I think beyond that, finding out, so like COVID really changes this answer, but postulating a world in which COVID no longer rules our every decision, I would say look to connect with small regional conventions that are really play oriented, like ones where you can kind of just show up and be like, I want to run this game 3 times, and I want to play in a few other people's games. Because that is often where I've made a lot of the connections that have been really fruitful and exciting. Those are people who I've like played really great games with, and they've gone on to share those games with others. So seeking out like regional conventions to play at. There's a few conventions that are really geared towards game design itself. Metatopia is one of them. It's in New Jersey.
Taking notes.
It would typically happen in November, but the organizers of Metatopia like work with every designer who signs up, and so it's like, what are you bringing to run? What kind of group are you looking to play with? What experience are you hoping they have? And like somehow go through their entire list of every attendee and what they're looking for, and like connect people together. And so it's a convention where the cost for a game designer who's bringing a game that they want to play test and a regular attendee is different. And it's not like dramatically different. It's not like you're paying hundreds of dollars for the luxury of access to playtest. It's just like you pay the designer ticket or you pay the attendee ticket. But they get to, if you're showing up and you're like, I wrote this game about Victorian England and it uses elaborate die pools. Like people are rolling like 30 dice at a time sometimes, and I really want to play with like technical players because it's a really technical Jane Austen game. Like they would pair you up with the best possible match for that.
Nice.
And so
I kind of want to play that game now.
Yeah, me too. One of us has to design it now. And so those are great. So those are some of my answers for how do you get players. Is like number one, talk to your friends. Number two, seek out small regional conventions. And number three, there are a few conventions and summits that are specifically geared to game design as a practice.
Okay.
And then in terms of like what you do with the game once it's finished and you're like, I want to share this with the world, I think there's kind of like a big like choose your own adventure fork in the road that is like, do you want to be a small business owner? And if you're a writer, you have to contend with that exact same question. I think like, do you want to understand contracts, bookkeeping, self-employed tax filing? Do you want to understand like product distribution chains? And if no, that's great because you just liberated yourself from like this entire technical world. You don't have to think about it anymore because now it's just like, well, do you want to share it with people for free? Do you want to share it with people for like latte money? Do you want to like have a small Kickstarter where you raise exactly enough money to hire an editor and an artist? Like you have a lot of choice. You can like print things off at Staples. You can distribute things for free online. Like there are so many different outlets. And if you're like, no, I want to make money. I want this to be my career, and I want to run a small business. I'm excited about being an entrepreneur. Then that's really a different process. Then what we're talking about is like, well, you probably want this in print because probably the way that you're going to make money is long tail income across the next decade. You really want to develop a small catalog of evergreen titles that will like attract people and then be able to promote cross sales.
I think we have to bring Avery back for our indie publishing episode and go into no, I'm serious, like that would be a great perspective on like, let's say you're doing that indie publishing small business route. What would it look like for game design? I think would be a great option. But if I could take you back actually to the less intensive version of it. So let's say someone was going to release this for people to play and like kick in some money if they feel like it. Is there like a place where that you would typically go to do that? Right? Where do the gamers hang out? I should know this before writing a game probably, but putting that aside. So
I feel like the answer to that changes fairly regularly. And so it is currently mid-February 2021. And I would say that the answer is if you want to release PDFs for free or for like, like here's a $3 or $5 offering. A really great platform is itch.io. It was originally a kind of like indie video game publishing platform, and now it's kind of expanded to also include a lot more tabletop role-playing game content. And they also host game jams over there, which is like someone will be like, I'm hosting a game jam where the idea is during these 3 weeks, write a game about bats and the stock market, and then you have to figure out that puzzle and
nice.
And it has to use a 4-sided dice.
Yeah, it's just like a creative fire. And like a constraint and a time window it's kind of like the same kind of concept, I think, as like NaNoWriMo, right? Like it's a pressure to create something that like leads to kind of some fruitful and interesting outcomes. But itch.io would be a good platform for that. There's a lot of really cool, weird experimental work that kind of pushes the boundaries of what a role-playing game even is that's being released on that platform right now.
Nice.
And in terms of like communities, where do people go? Conventions don't exist right now. And so that would be a really great answer. A lot of people are engaged in design conversations on Twitter. I think it's like a really weird place because it's never really clear, like how much is this an actual conversation versus like a platform for you to like soapbox versus marketing. And like how much are you talking to fellow game designers versus potential customers? Like there's and you can't clarify any of that in 280 characters, right? And so that is a confusing but potentially quite fruitful place to talk about role-playing games. There are some game design forums. Oh gosh, what is it called? The Gauntlet is has a forum and that is fairly active, and it's got an interesting mix of kind of more out there indie design and more kind of traditional, close to the fantasy adventure game kind of designs. There's an interesting spread of conversations that are happening there. I feel like I don't have a really great answer for that because I grew up as a designer in the era where there was the Forge, which was like a critical theory about role-playing games and like critical practices of deconstructing play and intentional like creator-owned design workshop. And I grew up in the era of story games, which is like a more chaotic free-for-all forum. And as those both got shuttered, Google Plus became like a real hub for conversations about independent role-playing game design and play for a lot of people.
And then that got shuttered.
And I feel like the place where I go to talk about role-playing games in a deep, thoughtful, and generative way hasn't existed since then.
That's so interesting. I mean, you're making me think that, we at the SLF were hoping to like start up probably on Discord some forums, and I had not been thinking in terms of a game design forum, but there's no reason we couldn't have one, right? So if you want to come run it, come give me a call.
We didn't say this podcast is sponsored by the Speculative Literature Foundation, and indeed, I think these are certainly your games qualify as speculative literature.
Right?
I would add to that, I'm learning a lot, and one thing I would add to that, which I think also applies to fiction, if you're sort of, which is also, if you're like, well, I'm starting out, what do I do? Is that making connections with individuals, both, and like not necessarily like if somebody is, it's hard to reach people who are like have stratospheric popularity. You know what I mean? If you tweet at like George R. R. Martin, he might tweet back, I don't know. But like people who are either in the same stage in the journey that you are, or are small creators or a little bit out, are usually like quite accessible and generous. And like if you fall in love with something, like in a way, if you want to play in a genre of art, like if you want to start creating and publishing and whatever, the finding things that you just like reading in it or playing in it, like going and playing these things and learning about them, and then just finding the things that you fall in love with and kind of hitching yourself to that, like where, so for a while, like Apocalypse World made this big splash, and for a while, I think they've again sort of died down. But when I discovered that, I ended up going to the forum that they ran, like the Apocalypse World, it was Bar Fourth Apocalyptica, where there was a bunch of different games about specific Apocalypse World hacks and everything, and that was just kind of a really neat. You could kind of learn a lot and make connections, and I think both cross connections with people who are also kind of at the same stage as you are, and also sort of like mentory connections where you're like, I really like this person, I'm going to see everything they do, and like where do they hang out? You know what I mean? And that's a really powerful way to get involved in things. It was kind of, and it's funny because I've sort of done that twice, right? Like I was around 30 when I started seriously writing science fiction, and just sort of like Corey, who we had on last time, emailed me when my first story was published, and like I also, both of us, both I and Marianne, went to Clarion, which is like the sort of boot camp for science fiction writers, and like all those people, and like everybody was my Clarion class, and in fact, like me and you, we were about at the same, in entering that world around the same time. And you were a little ahead of me in that you'd started this awesome magazine, but you know what I mean? It was sort of like making these connections with, finding people who are doing cool stuff and then just following them around like a puppy dog is like a very effective strategy. And then the funny thing is that then I did that again, like what? But no, it was 11. So 5 years. So I was like 45 or something when I was when I found Dream Askew, and I was like, I'm just going to watch Avery and see what she does.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like I'm sort of dipping my toe in and out of gaming. And so at some point I need to just kind of dive in, I think, and do a lot more playing of games. And it feels hard right now with the conventions kind of on hold. But of course, you can play these games on Zoom, right? I mean, in fact, you and I have played Fiasco with you in Switzerland running the game, right? And me in Chicago. So there's a lot of potential for
and
game
I've actually
community.
Just in the last year, I've seen, during the pandemic, I've seen people start doing games specifically designed around. There's like a lot of really interesting like stuff I've seen where people are starting to design around this medium. Like indie game designers are making games specifically for Zoom. It's really interesting, like takes on their game. Or there's one thing that before we completely depart from Dream Partner Skew, one thing I just want to mention, which I think is really fascinating, is when we we sort of skipped over the end of the story, but when we decided to launch the Kickstarter, the idea was, well, now there are 2 of these, so there could be more. So there was like a 3rd section of the book, which is like, make your own. And I honestly, like, I'm confessing this possibly for the first time, but I kind of thought that was a Hail Mary. I was kind of like, it's cool that there are 2 and it's neat that we're excited about this, but I don't know, is anybody really going to make one of these games? Like, we made these games. We think they're awesome. Like, maybe somebody else will make one, right? We gave some examples. We thought I thought it was an interesting conceptual idea. There are like a lot of them now.
That's great.
I am astonished that it worked. There's a podcast called Plus One Forward that like their summer season was all belonging outside belonging games, which are like, like I don't even know who all is making. So anyway, that's it was certainly was a good bet to hitch my wagon to Avery's game, because I am not the only one who wanted to make a Dream Askew hack. But the reason that occurred to me is I was going to say that one of the people who did something interesting in this space is, I'm going to say the wrong name, but the game Sleepaway.
Jay Dragon.
Jay Dragon's game Sleepaway, which is a really cool looking belonging outside belonging hack. I haven't played it yet, but it is amazing looking. Jay Dragon then released a supplement for it for the pandemic, because it's very much like a tactile game that you play in a physical space and everything. But then there's this specific like add-on for it that's like assumes you are playing over Zoom and reinvents the mechanics for that scenario. So I've seen a bunch of that kind of thing. And definitely there are things like the Gauntlet that Avery mentioned. There definitely like are institutions organizing a bunch of like online play. And a lot of the conventions that happened online. I mean, we went to WisCon online this year.
No, I actually went to I went to 7 conventions online last year, and some are more successful than others, but yes.
A lot of them had probably gaming. I mean, WisCon had a gaming track this year. You could, in fact, do online games on Zoom. So,
all right, we've kept Avery beyond time, so I think Avery should get to have final words. If there's anything that you are burning to say that we cut you off, which we sometimes do, any last thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I guess I have 2. Me and Benjamin have started to talk about the process of Dream Askew and Dream Apart being kind of designed in dialogue, and I feel like the last chapter that I really wanted to like mention briefly is that when you brought Dream Apart to me to show me, there were things in it that I was immediately like, oh, this is just so much better than what I did. Like I'd written this game and I was like, I wrote this game that's about queer community, but then there's no mechanics for like defining relationships to the wider community, and that's something that Dream Apart introduced. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, I need to steal that and reincorporate that into my game, because I've more written a game about queer aesthetics than I have about queer community, if those relationships aren't at the heart of the story. And so I kind of borrowed that back and then, shared my next iteration. And I think that Benjamin stole some things back. And then, there was this back and forth. And it was a really fun way of doing collaboration. Because I don't know about you, but like, I feel like my guard is so high whenever I try to do collaboration with people. I'm like, this is a project that I have invested like years of my life into potentially. Like, I am saying something about my own soul as an artist here. And so I like feel like I need to like fight tooth and nail to like have it adhere to my vision. It's really hard for me to push past that kind of defensive instinct in collaboration. But in this form of collaboration where like I had my project, you had your project, they were running really parallel and they could cross-inform one another, but like I didn't have to take your innovations and apply them to my game if I didn't want to. Like that, it was an interesting like back and forth ping pong sort of collaboration that felt a lot more, just a lot more like free and empowered, and I felt a lot less scared of the results than I might with different forms of collaboration. And I actually gave a talk about that process specifically. And so if any of the listeners like want to have like an hour-long deeper dive into that origin story of those 2 games, there's a link to that talk on my website, which brings me
put it in the show notes.
Well, and this is actually the final things. Yeah, go for it.
Which is this, I wanted to say
but before we get off that, I just want to say I would be remiss not to say that was such a delightful process. I mean, that was such a fun a fun collaboration. And it was so interesting to see what the game shared, and then also what was different about them, because partly one thing was because one of them is in the future and one of them is in the past. And you said some really interesting things, I think, in that talk about like what the different, the ways that they vary are as interesting as the way that they are in common. And the fact that like I had this whole like, here's this bunch of historical information that I have to both sort of dump on you, but also not make you feel overwhelmed by, like thread through and make you feel. And whereas you had a different problem because it was sort of like, well, take the world that you know and then create it, but that like that then you're in this free, this much more open space, but then that also has to be constrained. Anyway, you talk about it better in the talk, but that was really. It was a delightful process, and it was really interesting to see how the two games grew together and apart.
Yeah, agreed. And so, yeah, it's that talk is on my website, as are all of my games. And so if anyone was interested in checking any of them out, potentially picking one up, they are all available at buriedwithoutceremony.com. And Buried Without Ceremony is kind of the imprint that I do all of my work under.
Yay! And you can follow Avery on Twitter, obviously, as is it Avery Alder? It's
Lacking Ceremony is my handle.
All right. Well, we will get all that info.
Buried Without Ceremony.
Yes, we'll get all that info and put it in the show notes so that people will be able to find you.
And there is also. Are you still also doing? There's the Goblin. There's your. That's also maybe briefly an interesting note is a lot of people are using Patreon or Drip or whatever, and you have your sort of your own indie way of doing that, which
I do. I have a Patreon-esque thing. It's a seasonal subscription, and so once every solstice and equinox, I put out a newsletter, just updating people on everything that I've been working on and sharing a little gift. So a lot of my kind of work in progress or smaller form game design gets shared exclusively or early with the Goblin Friendship Club. And so there's information on the Goblin Friendship Club on my website as well.
Nice. Yay. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Avery. This was super interesting. I learned a ton. I'm sort of thinking I need to like go back to my department and instead of like doing a talk about game design, which is what I was thinking initially, I should just make them play a game. I'm picturing all of these English professors who like come in expecting a talk, and I'll be like, "Here you go, guys. We're gonna spend the next hour playing through this game." And I'm not quite sure how well they'd take it, but I think they'd have fun. So, all right. On that note,
thank you all for having me.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for coming. It was delightful to see you again.